I mean, President Trump has said it himself that he sees the United States as a mediating power. This by itself is the actual break.
Whereas for many Americans, particularly conservative voters, Ukraine is very far away and they are sick and tired of what they call the forever wars.
And certainly there is no way you can force Ukraine to make peace on the terms prescribed by Russia or Trump in this case. I mean, Ukraine has its own vital security interest.
Was the case last year in spring, where there was no munition anymore, where they needed something to be able to fight, and the fight is still continuing, and Russia is still targeting how to deal with that. So that's the insecurity that is there on the front line.
That if Ukraine fails, the war will not go far from Europe. It will get closer to Europe, because the next one absolutely will be either Moldova, which is again very nice strategic asset, or it could be testing the NATO's Article 5. Are Europeans ready to die for NATO?
Maybe in 10 years we will have dozens of countries with weapons of mass destruction in the world. If that's in the interest of the US, then go ahead.
Anyone following the recent news about the war in Ukraine has shifted their focus more and more to the big international stage. On the ground in Ukraine, the war remains a brutal reality. Every day, every hour, a human tragedy that hasn't stopped for a second. And yet something seems to be moving. The end of the war? Well, Russia could end this war. It is, after all, Russia's war of aggression. Ukraine is defending itself. As events unfold, one thing is certain: the effects reach far beyond Ukraine. So let's take a moment to step back and ask, where are we really? And what does all this mean for Ukraine, for Europe, for the US, and for the entire global order? In this video, I talked to 6 experts from different fields of research and practice. Their insights, their take on the bigger picture, coming up now. And my first guest is Andreas Umland. He is political scientist and an expert on contemporary Russian and Ukrainian history, and he is analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Andreas is joining us from Berlin. We'll begin with a Friday's event that we simply cannot ignore, as it has dominated headlines and debates across every media platform for days. Andreas, from your perspective, what was it, what we watched live from the Oval Office? What happened there?
Only the most obvious and the most fundamental thing has not been named so far. There's a lot of speculation of how much this was the setup, what are the motivations for Trump with regard to Russia, what are the connections of the Trump administration to Russia, what were the contents of the negotiations in Riyadh with Russia. But the most fundamental thing that happened in the White House to me was that the president and Thus America announced itself as a neutral country in this conflict. And that may sound at a first glance as something intuitive and right and balanced and so on, but that is not actually what has been the history of Ukrainian-American relations in the last 30 years, more than 30 years now, and also not what has been the relationship of the US to international law, and in particular to such principles as inviolability of borders, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty. The US has been very interventionist in the post-war period and has also intervened in other countries, but so far, at least, it has upheld the principles of inviolability of borders, in that borders cannot be moved and that you cannot simply reduce or expand states at your will just by military might. And now the US seems to accept that, and that is the large change in the position of the US in the international system. And it has also now moved itself from a partner of Ukraine into a neutral country, something like Switzerland or Saudi Arabia, where the talks with Russia were held, where now the US is sort of standing in between the Russian Federation on the one side and Ukraine on the other. And oddly here, the crucial negotiation that led to the current conflict were the trilateral negotiations between Russia, the US, and Ukraine in the early 1990s, which were about the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, and the US was then a crucial part of that, and that set Ukraine and Russia up for the current war. Russia has nuclear weapons and has taken over the seat in the UN Security Council from the Soviet Union. It has taken over its role in the nuclear non-proliferation regime from the Soviet Union. And Ukraine has, in these trilateral negotiations, then agreed to give up fully its nuclear weapons. It certainly could not have kept the whole arsenal of intercontinental missiles that it had inherited then from the Soviet Union, but it could have remained a nuclear power on a smaller scale, with a few warheads perhaps, and using its technological and scientific expertise to remain some sort of small nuclear power. And at this point, the European Union was not involved at all in all of this. Although now the European Union is tasked by the United States to help Ukraine and to solve this European problem. But this European problem was co-created by the United States in the 1990s. If there had been another arrangement, other security guarantees, not security assurances, as it was then formulated in the Budapest Memorandum in the 1990s, or if Ukraine would have been offered some sort of alliance, some sort of bilateral treaty like the one between South Korea and the US. And of course, why shouldn't South Korea solve its own problems somehow? It's not an American country, and can it still rely on this treaty? Or Ukraine could have become a NATO member or something like that. So the US has co-created the current situation and is now saying, well, it's now a European problem. We have disarmed Ukraine. We have let the Russia in the United Nations Security Council. We have sort of, but now we are out of it. Administration of Bush Jr. has given Ukraine in 2008 NATO membership perspective at the Bucharest summit of NATO. This is now all gone. It's sort of the US is now something like Switzerland, no obligations, just a European problem. Our task was just to disarm Ukraine, and all the rest is not of interest to us anymore. I mean, that's a very bizarre position, because this means, of course, that now many countries, not only Ukraine, but many countries around the world, will think about international law, international organizations, international solidarity. All of this is apparently not any longer valid. It's just made for the big countries, for Russia to expand its territory, for the US to play around with the smaller countries, and they may then decide to arm themselves with weapons of mass destruction. And if nuclear warheads are too expensive to produce, there are chemical weapons or biological weapons that are much easier to produce, and you can then create a deterrence potential that will be much better for your national security than relying on international law or international organizations, and certainly not on international solidarity. That is obviously the end of it here with this Trump administration.
As a result of escalation, Trump is now suspending most military support for Ukraine, and doing this, he is effectively aligning himself with Russia and Putin. Does Trump's administration understand the consequences of this decision, or is it even a plan?
That is difficult to say so far, because there is, of course, a whole conspiracy theory that goes back to Trump's visit to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and the possibility of then already having been sort of almost recruited by the KGB, because his visit was certainly then conducted with the agreement of the KGB by the interest travel agency and so on. And he was certainly surveilled during his visit. And then there is, from later visits, there is a story of a relationship between Trump and Putin. There's also apparently, as we now get to know, a relationship between Musk and Putin. They have some sort of a constant contact, apparently. And so this is all, we will have to wait for more certain information on all of that. But what can be now already said, that this is obviously the end of the not so much and not in first instance of the liberal international order, but of the international state order, in a way of the Westphalian system, you could say, where because nation states are not any longer secure, they can be reduced, and their borders can be moved, and genocide is possible, and you will then get some sort of compromise with which you can then with which the politicians who have initiated a territorial expansion of their country or conducted genocide can get away with. So that is already for certain, that we know already. The US is not yet delivering weapons to Russia, so it has only now stopped the delivery of weapons to Ukraine, which I think was actually the sort of the sense or the spirit of the Budapest Memorandum, and it was also certainly, it's not explicitly said there, but also of the strategic partnership between the US and Ukraine. It was also sort of implied in the membership perspective that Ukraine received in 2008 at the NATO summit. All of this would have been, that in such a situation, the US would help Ukraine, was all implied in all of this. This is now all void, and I mean, what the Republicans should do, they should consider what is their national interest, what is U.S. national interest. If it is in the U.S. national interest that weapons of mass destruction will spread, that the non-proliferation treaty for nuclear weapons is over, the conventions on biological and chemical weapons are also not in the interest of the U.S., then you can do that, and then you can then everybody is on her or his own, and then now we have around a dozen countries with weapons of mass destruction in the world. Maybe in 10 years we will have dozens of countries with weapons of mass destruction in the world. If that's in the interest of the US, then go ahead, but good luck with that.
When looking at Ukraine, at Kyiv, after what happened, what do you see? How are people reacting, and what is the general mood at the moment?
I mean, it's shocking, and when this, I've heard this from many Ukrainians, they couldn't sleep on Friday when this meeting was in the White House afterwards. They stayed awake, and I think Poroshenko said that half of the country stayed awake over the night. They couldn't fall asleep, and because people are getting very nervous now, because they are simply now left out there in the cold, and they've trusted the US. I mean, the odd situation for me as a German and as a European is that until recently, it was always so that the US was the more protective, the more active, the more realistic partner, on which one could rely. And the big problem were the West Europeans, the continental West Europeans, one has to say, the Germans, the French, the Dutch, and so on, that wanted to talk and to have some sort of, and the Nord Stream 2 project and whatnot, and all these ideas, we should trade, and then we'll somehow better understand each other. And the US has always been saying, well, we need to be realistic. And Trump has been scolding the Germans for Nord Stream 2, but now Trump wants to actually use Nord Stream 2. It has never been used, and there's one active string left. One has not been destroyed in an attack on it after it actually went out of operation. in summer 2022, when it was first put on hold, both Nord Stream pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and after that they were then attacked. There were these explosions in the Baltic Sea. One string is still operational, and now the US wants to actually use this. So this is a complete reversal of the situation we had a few years ago.
Thank you, Andreas Umland, political scientist, analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
From Berlin, we move to Switzerland, and I have now here Claudia Franziska Brühwiler, Professor of American Political Thought and Culture at the University of St. Gallen.
Good morning, Gulnaz.
Claudia, as a US expert, how did you perceive the exchange between Trump, J.D. Vance and Zelensky, especially considering that it all unfolded so publicly in front of the cameras?
I think the first reaction was, on my side, was the one that everyone had. It was a mixture of being flabbergasted, shocked, and also puzzled as to why we are witnessing this. But once one looks at the entirety of the press conference and looks at it in light of the remark by Donald Trump that this is going to make great TV, as he said, as well as the interview that Volodymyr Zelensky then later gave to Fox News, it all becomes a bit more understandable. We witnessed Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump first having actually a very amicable conference that where we heard the US president confirm that he would continue supporting NATO. He expressed his admiration for President Zelensky, and it all seemed like a prelude to the signing of the minerals deal that we were all expecting, and that was clearly lined up to happen that day. It, however, started to get derailed when Zelensky was trying to make Trump say something negative about President Putin. For instance, when he was showing pictures of war crimes committed by the Russian forces, when he was shaming Putin in front of the press, and was in a way trying to nudge Donald Trump to share into this. And we then have the question coming from the press as to Donald Trump being on the side of Putin too much. And this then triggered a reaction by J.D. Vance that then derailed the entire conversation. And so once one sees the entire conversation in the knowledge of how Donald Trump usually operates in negotiations, one is less surprised by how it played out. And we also have to see that President Zelensky, for all the admirable qualities he has, was misinterpreting the signs coming from the US. He was, in a way, taking this press conference as if we were on European soil, where he has a much more understanding general public. Whereas for many Americans, particularly conservative voters, Ukraine is very far away, and they are sick and tired of what they call the forever wars. And for many of them, this looks like another futile endeavor. And so Zelensky was in a relatively weak position, which is also reflected by how, shall we say, how muted the press response is in the US. We have Washington Post, New York Times, MSNBC, etc., shaming the president, but this isn't in as stark a manner as we see here in Europe. Whereas other venues call this a loss for both sides and are seeing both sides in the wrong, even though, of course, everyone is underlining that this is really unprecedented in how this has rolled out. But we're dealing with a president who does a lot of things in an unprecedented manner, rather less presidential and more, let's say, publicity-oriented manner.
Let's stay with this distinction between presidential and public for a moment. Reports suggest that Trump's team put significant effort into preparing President Zelensky for the meeting, with Senator Lindsey Graham reportedly advising him to maintain in a measured tone, to act in a certain way. Is such a detailed preparation common for foreign leaders meeting with Trump, or was it an exception?
This isn't really an exception for any meeting with a US president. A lot of foreign powers have their lobbyists, their friends on Capitol Hill, who will advise them how to approach and how to handle certain subjects, and who will also tell them who should they speak with beforehand, who do you need to have in your bag to get closer to the president, and how do you frame issues. So this is not at all unprecedented, and we see that we have old school Republicans such as Lindsey Graham, or in the past this would have been Mitch McConnell, who is also a friend of Ukraine, who do take an interest, who do consider this as part of their duty also as members of the Senate. We also see congressmen or congresswomen taking on these roles to help interest groups or foreign nations that they feel share their values, share their interests. And so this is not unprecedented. And in the case of someone like Donald Trump, with the history that he has with Volodymyr Zelensky, and this we have to see as well in the context of this meeting, the two have a long history of not being entirely amicable with each other. And with Donald Trump taking a lot of things very personally, it matters a lot how you approach then the continuation of the relationship, particularly if you are in a position where you really need the US.
The conversation in Washington seemed to escalate, with J.D. Vance playing a key role in this confrontation. How do you see his involvement in all this?
J.D. Vance is playing a very different role than what we're used to seeing from vice presidents. We have in the past seen vice presidents who have taken a strong role in foreign policy, but hardly ever as prominently as he did now in this setting. I think the only person I could compare this to is Richard Nixon when he was vice president under Ike Eisenhower, when he engaged in the so-called kitchen talk or kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev. And so this is rather unusual, but we have seen that J.D. Vance is building a profile. He's building a profile as someone who sees himself as running for president in 4 years, and who has to prove himself to the president, whose blessings he will need to run in 4 years, who said to the press that J.D. Vance is not the logical candidate for 2028. So he has to prove what he's made of, and that he has the president's back. He has already done so in Munich. And we also have to see this in light of what Vance already expressed as his beliefs as a senator. And he was always extremely critical of American aid to Ukraine. He does not see the necessity of the US supporting Ukraine. He does not see this as a Western fight for the freedom of our entire order, so to speak. And another point that has emerged now is he gave, at the beginning of Lent, a talk at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. That sounds like a very odd institution, and it is indeed a very American tradition. We have the National Prayer Breakfast, and then we have the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. And Vance then talked, and this was quite remarkable, not about the usual culture war issues that you would expect a believing Catholic address to a Catholic audience, but he talked about foreign policy and how he said that he saw the biggest alignment between Donald Trump's foreign policy and Catholic belief in Donald Trump's peace direction, that Donald Trump was above all committed in forging peace, as J.D. Vance felt that conflicts have often been to the detriment of Christian communities, and he felt that therefore a foreign policy that puts peace first is also a foreign policy that helps Christianity in general and that helps Catholics in particular.
Well, now Trump is cutting off most military aid to Ukraine, thus effectively siding with Russia. Is his administration fully aware of the consequences of this move?
He's not cutting it, he's pausing it. So he is using his discretion as a president. The Congress gave him the means to support Ukraine. He's now re-evaluating that. He will share his intentions tonight, actually, when he's giving his State of the Union address. So we will hear about his calculus. And of course, on the surface, everyone is now saying, well, the United States is now aligned with Putin. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, it does serve Putin for now, but it shouldn't be taken that Donald Trump is in Putin's bag. For Donald Trump does not want to be in anyone's bag, even though he might act in ways that come across as if he were, or that might mean that without knowing or unconsciously he is in someone's bag. So that is definitely not his interest, but his interest is that he wants a recognition from Ukraine for what the United States has done and how vital US support is. And I think there we are all in agreement that even though it's great that France and the UK are spearheading the endeavors for a peace agreement, we all know that peace through victory by Ukraine is virtually impossible right now, and it's further from anything that could be achieved without boots on the ground, not only by European forces but also by the US. And B, we also know that without the US, peace through an agreement is very hard to enforce, at least a peace that is durable, credible, and actually serves the remnant of the Ukraine nation.
In recent days, we've seen and read in the media about the ongoing protests in the US against Vance and Trump, and this is about broader political concerns. Do you think the public opposition could have a significant impact on Trump administration and its political standing?
At the moment, they have not really reached a level that is concerning. We're not looking at a weakened Nixon. And we have to remember that the United States has a very, very, shall we say, vivid protest culture. A lot of people nowadays in Europe have a very rosy memory of the Obama years, but we've then seen hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets against Barack Obama. And it still did not prevent him from going through with his agenda and to reform healthcare. So unless we're seeing a critical mass of not just left liberals taking to the streets, but actually Trump voters being dissatisfied and standing up against the president, this isn't really going to harm him. What will harm him is if he loses the support of his own party in Congress, and if he starts losing backing by his voters, because that would then cost him the midterm elections. But it's still far out. We're not talking midterms until next year in November.
Claudia, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and insights. Claudia Franziska Brühwiler, Professor of American Political Thought and Culture at the University of St.Gallen, who joined us now. My next guest is Alexei Yusupov. He heads the Russian program at Germany's Friedrich Ebert Foundation, based in Berlin. Alex, there is a lot of talk about relation between the US and Ukraine now, about recent events which may mark a real break in relations. What is your take on this development?
Well, indeed, the scenes and the outcomes that we witnessed in Washington, and also the statements afterwards about the cessation of the American support for the Ukrainian armed forces, it is more than just language. It's more than just talk, and it's actual decisions and actions that change the balance of power and forces, both on the ground between Russia and Ukraine, but also on the European continent. And we have to, as Europeans, we have to accept that the new US foreign policy seems to go for achievable and quick wins, showing that the United States can actually distance themselves from this war and this conflict. And I mean, President Trump has said it himself that he sees the United States as a mediating power. This by itself is the actual break with the Western alliance and inside the Western alliance. And if the US is an outside power, so a country which is inviting the two sides of the conflict to negotiate, but doesn't see itself actually as engaged in it in a meaningful way with political aims, then this is something completely new for us and for Europe. This is true. I have to say, however, that the idea that the United States would disengage from or decrease the level of their European engagement is obviously not new. So for Europeans and especially for Germans, it has been an ongoing topic since George W. Bush, the junior, probably, that the United States have foreign policy aims and objectives that are not rotating around Europe. Europe is not the cornerstone of the world, especially not of the American world. But indeed, up until now, I think there might have been this notion that the American political system might produce outcomes that are more and more disruptive, but it's not necessarily a strategy. And this might be the biggest insight for us, for Ukraine and for Europe, that it is obviously an American strategy to disengage itself from those conflicts, to refocus on aims that are only aligned with American interests and not to be an institutional supporter of whatever goes on in our continent. So this is new. This is a completely different era.
Looking at the European summit initiated by Macron, do you see a unified European position that can and will strengthen Ukraine militarily?
So this is a question of different time horizons, right? So in the short term, the most pressing question is, does Europe have a seat at the table for the coming negotiations? Because I mean, it is a European war, and the whole notion that it can be in any way come to an end, it can in any way come to an end between two extra European powers, so Moscow and Washington, who tried and started to negotiate in Saudi Arabia, and there are plans of non-European peacekeepers coming in after whatever the deal might actually look like. All of this can only work if both Ukraine and European countries are engaged into the negotiations and are part of them. But it's not about inclusivity as an abstract value. The quality of the diplomatic outcome is dependent on how much ownership the parties who will be those actually administering the new architecture, administering the new peace, are. How much ownership do they have? How strongly are they involved? And here, I think we can see on the European side of things that there is a very, very unified position saying whatever is the outcome, it can only be stable. And this is the actual goal. The actual goal is not just to end the war, but to end it in a way that it doesn't reignite just a short time later. It may be a year or two. That doesn't really matter if it starts again. And for this to be achieved, Europe has to speak with one voice. And I would say the European Union has never been so close to a unified position as now. And even countries that have a very distinctively different approach, like Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban in writing has expressed his alignment with the US stance on it. Well, I think for the first time, we might see a creation of an internal inner European coalition of the willing who will proceed anyway. And if member states, not all member states, are agreeing, then this would be the beginning of something new, maybe a European Union which will focus on defense with those countries who want to do it, and leaving aside those who will not match the speed. But coming back to your question, this is a new situation. This is a new solidarity and new unity. And I think the conversation now is not just about the midterm, but also the short term, but also about the midterm. And the midterm is the question of money. And we've heard President of the Commission von der Leyen saying that she will put forward an initiative to relax fiscal rules and financial rules for the European Union. In parallel to that, in Germany, we have an unprecedented shift towards creating a new fund for crisis expenses, both for military infrastructure, going towards 1 trillion euro. So things are happening very fast. because the European Union is now reacting to absolutely objective shifts in its context. The European Union now knows that this is the window of opportunity to stand on its own feet. And as again, the probable chancellor to be said in a very remarkable way. I mean, Friedrich Merz is a very transatlantic politician, and he comes from the most pro-American political party in the German landscape. But he said himself that his goal is to achieve the most possible independence. This is the word he used, from the United States as quickly as possible. So this is a different era completely. I repeat myself, but it's important to understand.
The Kremlin says Trump's policy shift is largely in line with Russia's interest, but the Russian media is showing a cautious, rather moderate positive reaction. Why so little excitement there?
I think the Russian strategy at the moment is to be patient, and this is the rational thing for them to do because they observe those new rifts and frictions inside the Western alliance, and they can only win. The situation on the ground is positive to them, so Russia's resources are not as depleted as the Western coalition has hoped, and not as depleted as Ukraine would need them to be in order to actually force Russia to the negotiation table. So Moscow can take some time and observe, and all of the indications we can see go towards a strategic, at least restart of the US-Russian relations, and the bill will be footed by the Europeans and Ukrainians. So in this constellation, Moscow has actually achieved its major foreign policy objective to be treated as an exceptional power that is not subject to rules of the international law and of the normal, quote unquote, diplomatic procedures. If they are gonna be the one protagonist, or let's say counterpart of the United States, talking to them directly, dealing with them directly, getting some kind of a new agreement that will be supported by actions coming out from the White House, and we can see it taking up shape, then it's already a victory. This is much more important to Vladimir Putin than actual territorial gains in Ukraine, the actual reinstatement of Russian exceptionalism. Russia is not just any power in their own view, but a country that is to be treated as one of the fundamental pillars of the international order. And so far, actions by the White House have actually brought Russia closer to victory. So why would they hurry? They can just lean back and observe.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Alexei Yusupov, heading the Russian program at Germany's Friedrich Ebert Foundation, who joined me from Berlin. And we are now switching to Tallinn, Estonia, and I have a pleasure to introduce my next guest, Gert Ansu. Gert Ansu is Director for Division Ukraine, Moldova and the South Caucasus at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he previously served as ambassador to Ukraine and to Belgium, Luxembourg and Switzerland, and is also a deputy permanent representative to the European Union. Hello, Gert. Good to see you.
Hello. Nice to talk to you.
Gert, how would you summarize this disastrous meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump in Washington? What are the implications?
Well, for us, first of all, it's most unfortunate, of course, because the only way one can fight back against the Russian aggression is by preserving our unity, the unity of the West, our solidarity with Ukraine, and to see that damaged in such a way, well, it's not helping anyone but Russia, of course.
You have a lot of contacts with Ukraine. What was the reaction there?
Well, there was the initial shock, but then, I mean, one often perhaps overuses the word resilience, but actually Ukrainians, they are the epitome of resilience. And they have been through so much over the last 3 years that they were able to gather themselves very, very quickly. And the secondary response was well, full support to their own president, even from the opposition, even those people who, have not been too happy with the president, perhaps in the sense of domestic politics, but there is no other way than coalesce around their president, and they have no other way but to keep up the fight, because surrendering because of some talk in a at a certain meeting, that's not an option. That's not the luxury that the Ukrainians would have.
The leaders of 18 EU countries met in London for a special London summit on Ukraine, but the Baltics were not represented there. Why?
Well, as far as we know, it was still more of an accident than by design. But that's the thing that happens, or that may happen, with coalitions of the willing. We are seeing that it's difficult to reach decisions within the EU, within NATO. So I guess it's inevitable that we are moving towards a coalition of those who are really willing to keep helping Ukraine. But then, if you don't have established procedure, a list, an established or the usual list of invitees, well, then you may run into trouble. So, but maybe it was a rocky start in this sense, but well, we'll manage, I'm sure. And certainly, the Baltic states, at least per capita, are among the biggest supporters of Ukraine, and it's only natural that we should be behind the table.
Russia remains Estonia's neighbor, a geopolitical reality that will not change. And it has been involved in a cyber war with Russia for many years now. How does this affect the daily lives of Estonians?
I don't think people really notice the attacks because, well, the system is resilient enough, and actually it hasn't been disturbing our daily life. Well, people might know Estonia also got an early start in 2007 with cyber attacks against Estonia. And so that means we've been taking the matter very seriously for the last 18 years. And basically, the infrastructure is functioning perfectly well. I mean, we were detached from the Russian electricity grid and connected to the mainland European one a few weeks ago. Everything went smoothly. So basically, in this sense, I don't think the Baltics are really that special anymore, because you have cyber attacks, well, against plenty of countries in the world. I mean, including Western Europe. So it's not just us. Even if we are physically neighbors of Russia, well, I mean, cyber attack, for being attacked by cyber means you really don't have to be a neighbor.
Well, it's difficult to see the Trump administration's decision to cut military aid to Ukraine as a step towards peace. Is it even a step towards an alliance with Russia? Is this the plan?
Well, that's a very good and valid question. To answer that properly, of course, one would have to see inside the heads of President Trump or people in his administration, and that's difficult to see. Well, at least what one can see at the moment, certainly it's not conducive to unity among the Western alliance or the Western countries. And certainly there is no way you can force Ukraine to make peace on the terms prescribed by Russia or Trump in this case. I mean, Ukraine has its own vital security interests. It cannot disarm, it cannot unilaterally stop shooting, it cannot be forced to give up territory, because, well, that would be contrary to, well, all the principles we hold dear, the UN Charter, the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity. So basically, anything that will be agreed will have to be agreed by Ukraine as well, even if the US would reach an agreement with Russia. Well, wouldn't matter too much, because you still need the agreement of Ukraine. And anything that concerns the security of Europe, the security structures of Europe, well, that would need Europe's agreement as well. So it is concerning, yes, but well, we will not just be in neither Ukraine nor we in Estonia or in Europe. Can we be just price takers?
Thank you very much, Gerd Ansu, Director for Division Ukraine, Moldova and South Caucasus at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And my next guest is Margarita Antoni, Vice President of the Ukrainian Association in Switzerland, and she's joining me from Basel. Hello, Margarita, good to see you too. A great television, that's how Donald Trump described the discussion in the Oval Office. I'm sure you've been following the developments. How did you feel? Can you describe your feelings?
Well, the moment I actually seen what happened at the Oval Office was very special one. I was just returning from International Cooperation Forum at ETH Zurich, where at that moment right before Ignatius Cassis was talking about the power of law and the importance of how we should hold to it. And then basically you go out and you see how somebody who until now represented part of the security backup that we are having within our international law system to bully Zelensky on live television. It was it was shocking, to be entirely honest. It was shocking. It was kind of okay, now it's real.
My previous interview mentioned that many Ukrainians didn't sleep in the night of February 28th. What do you hear? What is the general mood there?
Well, many Ukrainians are very surprised by what happened, but they're also kind of this is the Ukraine attitude in that sense. They're saying, okay, so what do we need to do next? So not sleeping, being angry, being confused, being irritated, that was surely the case. But also at the same time, the day after, if you heard what people are talking about, if you read comments from Ukrainian side, if you also talk to people there, which happened in my case, they're mostly saying like, okay, so what now? How can we faster run our defense industry? How can we get support by others? Like, it's more like, okay, great, we see it. Trump has a friend and he's going to stick to his friend, and this friend happens to be our mortal enemy. So what are we going to do now? That's more of the attitude.
Margarita, your own family members, two of your cousins are on the front line in Ukraine, and they are the first to be affected by the change in US policy. Have you had a chance to talk to them? What did they say?
One cousin, no, I couldn't reach him. Let's hope he's okay. The other cousin, he just returned for a couple of days of break. Well, he's saying like mostly they're all very worried about what it means if the fight goes on, and we have again the situation that was the case last year in spring, where there was no munition anymore, where they needed something to be able to fight, and the fight is still continuing, and Russia is still targeting how to deal with that. So that's the insecurity that is there on the front line. But otherwise, it's not like Ukrainians have a chance. I think this is something, or have a choice in this matter. They're being attacked, and I think we shouldn't forget that regarding what rhetorics and storylines are being told on social media or live reality, great television, like Donald Trump is saying. Ukrainians are fighting for their existence, so it's not like they have much of a choice to just say, okay, good, no, come kill us. It's insecurity mostly, in terms of are we going to have the weapons that we need now, or what does it mean now?
Let's talk about Ukrainians and Americans. In an interview with Fox News after the meeting with Trump, Zelensky said that difficulties can be overcome because the relationship is between people in Ukraine and America, not just between two leaders. Do Ukrainians share this position? Do they feel the same way?
Well, the same day where Donald Trump did his reality TV was the day when in Kiev they've been having a parade for an American who came to fight with Ukraine and died, a 23-year-old former Marine, who died there and who they've been honoring. And there've been a lot of videos of Ukrainians who are in Ukraine, who are fighting, who are helping, who are supporting also on in terms of humanitarian aid, and who are standing with Ukraine. The amount of protests all over US is amazing, is great. I have so many US friends who are writing to me, hey, look, we are leading the protest. For instance, a very good friend of me in Seattle, they're saying they're not covering it. Why the fuck are they not covering it? We are leading it. We are not okay with what is happening. So I think on the sense of people, the relationships are still very much intact because we see a lot of support. The other question is the current administration and how they are working, and this is where the issue is.
What do you think? Will Volodymyr Zelensky manage to convince Trump to support Ukraine after all? Or is it not to be expected?
Well, I think there is one thing that we should be very aware of is whatever Trump is saying is not reliable. It's same as whatever happens around Putin. But there is one reliable thing over all Trump's outings of the last decade is he kind of has his ties around dictators and power. So as long as Zelensky and Ukraine is not having power, and this power could be if European Union really stands behind, if they're really close around Ukraine, if they really show, okay, we are here, we have a strength. And let's be honest, like Russia has 1/12 of GDP than European Union has. So European Union is a huge power. They just have to stick together. So if that happens, that we have a totally different situation. But unfortunately, I think as long as Trump sees Zelensky as the weaker part, he will be not very good, reliable partner to Ukraine.
And my last question will be, given all the actions Europe has taken in recent days, do you see a greater level of consolidation and resolve in Europe now?
Well, I think right now there are no excuses left. Like before, it was still like, okay, so we don't believe that that US will just drop Ukraine. Like there was all the time kind of in the room, you know. They've been talking about, yeah, we have to support, we have to stand up, and Europe been supporting Ukraine way more than US at the end of the day. But it was like always this, we've been still relying that US is there, and now it's kind of clear it's not there. So I actually think that this unity first time is historical since the start of Russian aggression against Ukraine, and I think it's first time that it should lead to factual support. And as I said, like if European Union manages to create a shield around Ukraine and to be a partner with Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine has right now one of the most advanced defense industry innovations. They're pumping so much force into defense innovations comparatively to Europe, that Ukraine could be a great partner, like also for other aggressions which we could expect coming, especially from Russia in the next years. And I think right now is the chance, and I really, really hope that European leaders will take this chance and actually not only talk, but follow up with action.
Margarita, thank you very much for joining me. It was Margarita Antoni, Vice President of the Ukraine Association Switzerland, who joined us from Basel. And now we go to Lund in Sweden, and it's my pleasure to introduce my next guest. It's Tonika Mitrevelli, Associate Professor in the Sociology of Religions at Lund University. Dear Tonika, what insights did the meeting between Zelensky and Trump provide, and what key lessons can we learn from this?
I think there is an interesting question about the strategic usage of this event. So if US administration is somewhat deliberately shifting its foreign policy and somehow forcing Ukraine into a frozen conflict, and they try to dismantle this aid as a tool to help Ukraine, generally serve American diplomacy, then compelling question is why they're making it. So what was this show about? Power of display of power, the sense of this humiliating Zelensky, Was it for domestic audience? Was there underlying strategic and political ideological motives? Well, there are several explanations, I think, which one reads from the event. I think the first one is maybe the realliance towards isolationism. This is the most convincing part, that America alone kind of story, that Trump-Vance foreign policy appears to be more or less, from the campaign at least, because it's just the 1 month and there's a lot of stuff already happened, more or less their policy is rooted in very anti-globalist, isolationist framework. If you look at the München speech of Vance again, there's a lot of messages to that. Where US is committed to allies is somewhat relativized. It's seeing allies as burdens rather than strategic assets. So foreign aid, for example, or military support are reframed as handouts rather than investments in the stability. So this sort of vision, dismantling of the USAID, for example, or removing Ukraine from the priority list, that fits this broader vision. Of course, that is the question is what consequences will it have? Another aspect which I find also slightly less convincing, but also really feasible, it might be just personal thing for Trump, appeasement of Russia for a deal, and a personal admiration for Putin. So if the first part is more realignment and foreign policy change, there might be a personal issue that it is rooted in the grievance politics, compromise, economic interest, admiration in general for authoritarian leadership, and belief in Trump's vision that actually Russian model is a modus operandi for this sort of hereditary autocracy, and democracy maybe is not the answer. So forcing Ukraine into frozen conflict serves, of course, Russian interests and legitimizes its territorial gains. And in return, Trump seeks to, I guess, secure some kind of goodwill from Moscow for geopolitical concessions elsewhere in China, Iran, Middle East, whatnot. But avoiding escalation is a thing. And the third thing is that it could be just a domestic political message to the Republican Party line, because we're seeing that the Republican Party is transforming into a nationalist, populist sort of social movement, whatever MAGA is. And I'm maybe vague conceptually here. It is different institutionally, but still MAGA's support base is ideologically nationalist populist. And foreign engagement, especially via aid or supporting Ukraine, is framed as betrayal of domestic priorities. So fixing America first is the message, and clearly they follow this line. Attacking Ukraine is an electoral purpose. It shows that, well, Biden was this loser guy. His Biden era policies are entangling US in this unnecessary foreign dramas, foreign wars, and Trump is there to fix it. He's the peace candidate. So that is, I think, like three key elements, again, from multilateralism to unilateralism, from deterrence to sort of this appeasement / admiration of Putin or autocracy, and from global leadership to the national retrenchment. That's more or less the three convincing stories from the analysts that we read and those of us who follow American politics, aside from the outsiders at least. That seems to be the case as of now, but things are developing very fast. And the real question is how far this will go and what happens when the world adjusts to America being no longer a reliable ally. So what happens then?
After all what happened recently, do you see a unified European stand capable effectively of arming Europe and supporting Ukraine?
Well, probably we don't see that unified. We see this sense that, well, Ukraine is not just fighting for its own survival. There is this understanding. It's a firewall that prevents this sort of a cascade of geopolitical catastrophes. I wrote extensively about that in a few days ago. But there is a disagreement within EU. We see Hungary, we see Italy, the Baltic states and France and Britain seem to be more or less on the same page. There is this gray area, while the German recent commentary from the Germany also very promising. But I mean, there should be a reflection, and experts talk about this all the time, that if Ukraine fails, the war will not go far from Europe. It will get closer to Europe, because the next one absolutely will be either Moldova, which is again very nice strategic asset, or it could be testing the NATO's Article 5. Are Europeans ready to die for NATO? Why would we not give it a shot? So if Kremlin apparatchiks and thinkers, strategic thinkers, think about it like, well, what can we gain? They will not do it tomorrow morning. Of course, they will need rearm. They will need to, if they win this territorial war, let's say on 9th of May, Putin is triumphant, taking Ukraine's 20%, getting the deal, and he won the war. Well, let's look back to the patterns, Russia's past actions. There is a clear pattern. Georgia 2008. Russia invaded, West did nothing, little. Crimea, Donbass 2014, limited sanctions, no military response. Ukraine 2022, a full-scale, full-blown war invasion. Each time Putin escalates because he faces no consequences and deterrence. So why would it not be Moldova? Why would it not be a Transnistrian region, which is a perfect setup to intervene there? Moldova is not a NATO country. Its pro-Russian forces are actively trying to destabilize its government. Energy economic leverage makes Moldova very vulnerable, very weak in that front. After Moldova, why not Baltics? And I'm not paranoid here, because we see the strategic importance, and clearly we see this pattern recurring. Regime that needs the crisis, the Putin's regime needs crisis, but they do not need the crisis to get out of control. So they had to have crisis to legitimize their repression at home, but the crisis should not get out of control, and it will not go out of control if they're strategically shooting the targets, such as Moldova, Estonia, and testing, right? What is happening? Is this Article 5 without US a thing? Or maybe it's not. Why won't we call a bluff? If there is, let's go back a little bit and see what's happening. So I think that is more or less where we are at. And Kaliningrad or Suwalki Gap, for example, Suwalki Gap is Europe's weakest link. And that's, would NATO actually respond if, for example, there is the, somehow Russia explores the possibility of instrumentalizing these Russian speakers in the Baltics? And how will NATO even transport and organize? Because Europe was sleeping for decades, basically being fully reliant on the US. So this is a very big debate.
Thank you very much, Tornika, for joining me. Tornika Mitriveli, Associate Professor in the Sociology of Religions at Lund University, was reflecting on the situation on Ukraine. As we conclude this expert statement series on situation in Ukraine, I want to thank my guests. Thank you for watching, and we remain committed to following developments closely. Stay tuned for more insights.